The woman was found dead in her home. The police began to investigate and immediately discovered several disturbing leads. The longer they worked it out, the more weird and creepy things came up. A few years later, they finally managed to get to the truth, but no one expected such an outcome. Friends, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like, it's very important to me. Karen Gregory was born on March 29, 1948, in Albany, New York. She was the eldest of 4 children and helped her parents take care of their siblings from an early age. The girl was interested in sports and spent a lot of time in nature. Besides, she loved art and wanted to work in this direction. After graduating from high school, Karen enrolled in a college in Rochester. There she earned a Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Science degree. After this, a woman worked for several years as an art teacher in primary school and then decided to become a graphic designer. In 1983, when she was 35, she moved to Florida, where she met a man named David McKee. He worked as a manager for an organization that provided counseling services to Vietnamese veterans. She and Karen quickly developed a mutual sympathy. The couple dated for a little over a year, and in the spring of '84, David asked her to move to a town called Gulfport. Prior to this, Karen had rented an apartment with her friend and had to drive her car to David's. The woman accepted the offer and began gradually moving her belongings to him. On May 22, Karen took the rest of her things from the apartment and finally moved out of there. She told her neighbor that she was a little nervous. David went to another state for work to speak at a conference, and she had to bring a whole week in his house alone. From the apartment, the woman went to her friend. They had a great time at her house. Karen told her that she is very happy with David and is happy to finally live with him. The friends communicated until about midnight, after which Karen drove to David's house. The next day, the man called home several times, but no one answered the phone. He thought Karen might have stayed in her old apartment and called her roommate, but the woman said she hadn't seen her since yesterday. David then called several of Karen's friends and her sister, but none of them saw the woman. He kept trying to reach her all day, but received no answer. The next day, on 24 May, David called home again early in the morning. He was hoping to catch Karen before she left for work, but still no one picked up the phone. A little later, he called her boss and found out that the woman had not come to work. At this point, David's anxiety reached its limit. He feared something bad might happen to Karen, so he called local hospitals and police station. Upon learning that no one matching Karen's description had been admitted, he decided to call his neighbor Emma. The man asked her if Karen's car was in front of the house. She looked out the window and answered, yes. It only added to the alarm. David asked the neighbor to go to the house and try to knock on the door. He was so worried that he stayed on the line until Emma left to do his bidding. Emma went to the side door first and knocked, but there was only silence. Then she came to the front door and immediately noticed something strange. Most of the door was glass, and in some places it was broken. Shrapnel lying on the path in front of the house. Emmy walked around the house and saw that one of the windows was open. As she approached, she shouted Karen's name several times, but there was no answer. Then the woman stretched her hand out of the window, pushed the curtain back, and a shocking sight opened before her. The window was in the bedroom, and behind it was a corridor. There was a woman's body on the floor, covered in blood. Emma couldn't see her face because it was behind a wall. She knew Karen was there. Recovering from the shock, Emma ran to her home, where David was still waiting on the phone for her. The woman picked up the phone and barely said anything terrible had happened. After that, she dropped the call and dialed 911. The doctors quickly arrived at the scene, but they only had to confirm Karen's death. The detectives began to examine the crime scene, which was horrifying even experienced police officers. Based on the amount of blood all over the house, Karen fought her attacker to the last. Traces of blood ran from the corridor to the front door, where several pieces of glass had been broken. At this point, detectives noticed several stranded hairs matching Karen's. They assumed that the woman almost managed to run into the street, but the attacker caught up with her. In the bathroom, the investigators were waiting for the first clue. They found a bloody footprint on the floor. The police checked Karen's legs and found no trace of blood on them, which means the footprint belonged to her killer. except it was unclear why he walked around the victim's bathroom without his shoes. Medical experts examined the victim's body and concluded that she had received about 20 stab wounds. She was also assaulted, and experts extracted the biological material of the perpetrator. Unfortunately, no DNA test was used in '84, so this evidence couldn't help them identify the killer. In addition, several bloody fingerprints were found on her body. They were too smeared to be used. According to the experts, the woman was killed about 30 hours before being found. It meant she was attacked the night she got home from a friend. There was another point that immediately caught the eye of the police and the doctors as they saw Karen's body. She was wearing a tank top and a lacy corset. Apparently, the perpetrator did it. When the police finished searching the crime scene and collected all possible evidence, they allowed Karen's friends to start cleaning. The women didn't want David to see all that horror when he arrived. All the victim's acquaintances knew how much the man loved her and wanted to ease his suffering. David's conference was held across the country, so it took him a long time to get home. Meanwhile, detectives began interviewing the neighbors. This area was considered quite prestigious and safe. The crime rate there was extremely low. Many residents knew each other, and they even had a neighborhood watch. It's a form of arrangement between neighbors where they keep an eye out and report any suspicious activity to the police. In this case, however, the neighborhood watch did not perform its function. Detectives discovered that on May 23, at around 1:15 a.m., 16 residents of the area heard a piercing woman scream, and none of them called the police. They all said the scream snapped quickly, and they didn't get the impression that anyone could be in danger. Even the head of the neighborhood watch, who was living pretty much against the victim, didn't feel the need to call the police. He was fixing his motorcycle in the garage and listening to the radio when he heard a muffled scream. The man came out of the garage, walked down the street, and did not notice anything suspicious. After that, he returned back. A neighbor who lived opposite David shared an interesting observation. On the morning of May 23, she saw that the front door of his house was open. She also heard the scream that night, but did not connect it to the open door. There was a nuance to her story. When the police arrived, the door was locked. Given that the body had been in the house for about 30 hours, the perpetrator could have come back and tried to cover his tracks, including closing the door. It is noteworthy that there were no signs of forced entry on any of the doors. Detectives assumed that the perpetrator could have climbed through the back window, but there were no signs of forced entry. Either Karen left it open all night, or she knew the killer and she let him in. The head of the neighborhood watch shared another interesting observation with the detectives. The night after Karen's murder, an unidentified man drove up to her house. He got out of the car, knocked on the door several times, and kept looking around. The man then returned to the car, but a few minutes later he again left with a piece of paper in his hand. He put it on Karen's windshield before he left. The police immediately checked the car and indeed found a note on the glass. It said, "Karen and David, hi, stopped by your place around 7:15, but saw no sign of life. I have a lot to do tonight, so I probably won't be back. But I have what you asked." Detectives immediately paid attention to the formulation of signs of life, given that at the time of the arrival of this man, Karen was dead almost a day. Such a choice of words was very disturbing. At the end of the note there was a name, Peter. The researchers tried to find him. It turned out that all the time he was right in front of them. Shortly after the discovery of the body, the man heard about it from Karen's former neighbor and went to their house. The man cooperated actively and answered all questions. He volunteered his fingerprints and feet and told me what he was doing outside the victim's house. According to Peter, a few days earlier, Karen had called him and invited him and David to dinner. But there was one thing. Karen allegedly told him that David would also be with them, although he was already on his way for a week. Peter was also asked what exactly he meant by the phrase in the note, "I have what you asked for." The man said he borrowed the tape and was going to return it. Another strange thing was that Peter allegedly missed the shards on almost the entire path to the front door, not to mention a few broken windows. The man insisted that he had not seen anything like this or did not pay attention to it. While talking to him, one of the detectives noticed a large cut on Peter's hand. Seeing a policeman staring at his hand, the man closed the place and said that he constantly had some scratches after playing with dogs or repairing his car. All of the above seemed extremely suspicious, and the detectives decided to check his alibi. Peter said he slept at his house the night of the murder, and his roommate confirmed it. The police took their time to dismiss him as a suspect, as an alibi of this kind could be easily lied about. However, the investigators quickly found another suspect. David is Karen's boyfriend. According to him, he was in Rhode Island that night, 2,000 km from his home, sleeping in his hotel. But at the scene, the police found a very interesting lead. There was a local Rhode Island newspaper dated May 23, the same day Karen was killed. It was very strange, and the detectives began to wonder if David might have flown to Florida, killed his girlfriend, and been back before his next performance at the conference. They calculated the time of flight and travel from the airports, and then came to the conclusion that this is indeed possible. On the plus side, no one could corroborate David's alibi for that night, as he allegedly slept in his hotel room alone. The head of the neighborhood watch also shared his observation. He repeatedly noted that there were arguments between David and Karen when a woman visited his home. David insisted that they had a great relationship and the couple almost never fought. When David was asked about the newspaper, he said he bought it on May 21 at a store near his home. The man was going to take her on a trip so he could have a week's forecast. Investigators came to this store and the seller confirmed that they had the newspaper for sale. He even remembered that David had bought it on the 21st. According to the seller, the publication did issue the issue in a few days, which is common in print newspapers. Thus, the suspicion of David faded. They asked him if anything was missing from his home. The man discovered there was no white lace corset that Karen had bought herself a few months earlier, almost the same as the one who was dressed as Karen's killer. This immediately led the detectives to believe that the perverted criminal took him as a trophy. The police decided to follow up on another lead they found at the victim's house. It was a very high-quality clock drawing signed by the name of Stephen Fisher. Detectives noticed one particular detail. The leaf looked like it was covered in blood. Detectives quickly discovered that Stephen was working with Karen at the same company and interviewed her colleague. There were many interesting things waiting for them. Almost all the employees said that Stephen was a rather strange man. He tried very hard to look after all his female colleagues, shared pictures of perverted things with them, even wrote a perverse poem trying to persuade colleagues to read it. All the women who worked with him confessed that Stephen scared them. Karen also complained several times about his behavior, but the management did not pay much attention to it. The detectives talked to him, and the man denied giving Karen the drawing. He also stated that he barely knew the victim and offered to undergo polygraph in order to prove his innocence. The investigators quickly arranged such an interrogation, and here began the most interesting. It was quiet at first, but after one question, Stephen suddenly said he killed Karen. Just seconds later, he took it back and said it had nothing to do with anything. The strange thing was that in both cases, the polygraph operator did not fix the lie. It threw the detectives off, but they couldn't rely on the polygraph. This instrument is very far from ideal and simply is not able to accurately determine a person's lie or not. In doing so, they realized that Stephen was clearly a very strange man and could say anything. Experts soon examined his drawing and concluded that the red spot on his drawing was left with ketchup, not blood. As a result, they began to doubt that Stephen had anything to do with Karen's murder. Despite this number of suspects, the police were never able to gather enough evidence against anyone. The case had stalled for several months. The detectives were still investigating, but failed to find new leads. It lasted until December, when something interesting happened. One of Gulfport's esteemed residents was retiring, and a special event was organized to commemorate the event. It was attended by a large number of people, including a woman named Mary, she talked to a policeman who was also there. The conversation revolved around the murder of Karen Gregory, and Mary inadvertently mentioned that she also heard her shrill scream that night. The officer immediately noticed a strange point. Mary lived 2 blocks from Karen's house, and initially the police didn't even question the residents of those remote homes. The fact that the woman heard the scream said it was really loud. Except the head of the neighborhood watch, who lived practically opposite Karen's house, described him as muffled. But if the scream was heard by the neighbors 2 blocks away from this place, the man obviously couldn't find him quiet. Especially since at that moment the man was in his garage with the door open. All this was doubtful, but the police were slow to suspect the head of the neighborhood watch, George Lewis, 22 years old. He worked as a firefighter and was a good friend of almost all officers of the local police station. He lived with his wife and young child. All the neighbors referred to him as a trustworthy and decent person. However, the detectives could not ignore Mary's story. They called George and asked him to come by the station when he had time. The man agreed but never came. It's worth mentioning that before that, he came to the station regularly just to hang out with his friend. The lead detective on the case was at his wedding, so it was hard for him to picture George as a killer. Only a month later, in January of '85, they were able to talk to him. George insisted that the scream did not seem so loud to him. The detective asked him if he had remembered anything else about that night. He asked him if he had forgotten anything else. But George told him the same thing except for one moment. When his statement was taken for the first time, the man said that he heard a scream, went out of the garage and walked down the street. But this time he said that he had only come to the road, looked around and came back. Given that many months had passed since then, the discrepancy did not seem to be serious. However, the police decided to verify that he was telling the truth and offered to undergo interrogation. George agreed, but to their surprise did not pass it. The next time he spoke to the detectives, the man admitted that he had hidden one fact from them. He said he saw an unknown man outside Karen's house that night. All George could remember was that he was tall and his hair and beard were red. The detectives again doubted that he was telling them the truth. George never quite explained why he didn't mention the man. All he said in the first interview was that he was scared because the man knew where he lived and could have harmed his family. Despite this, the police tried to check this lead and find this man. However, the result was 0. Here was another nuance. Between George and Karen's houses was almost 30 meters, and the street was pitch black. The detectives doubted that a man could see the color of another man's hair, but George kept insisting on his. The police recreated the events of that night and asked George to describe the man who stood 30 meters away. The man couldn't see a single detail, which made the detectives even more suspicious. However, they searched the area and asked the locals if they had noticed a suspicious man with red hair who could walk their streets at night. To their surprise, several women at once admitted that they sometimes noticed a man peeking in their windows at night. None of them saw the man's face, but one woman did manage to spot him, and she said he looked a lot like George Lewis. She wasn't 100% sure because it was dark outside and the man ran away. George admitted that he did occasionally look into the neighbors' windows, but claimed to have done so specifically for their own safety. He said he was just trying to make sure they were okay because he was in charge of his neighborhood security as head of the neighborhood watch. But all this only reinforced the suspicion about him. In March of '85, George agreed to a second polygraph. This time he changed his story again. The man confessed that he had not only seen the man in front of Karen's house, but had come to talk to him. He told George that he would kill him if he told anyone about him. The polygraph operator fixed the lie again. Then the investigator asked George directly whether he had killed Karen Gregory. The man replied in the negative, and again his words were considered false. After that, the detectives decided to talk to his wife. She said that that night she woke up from a piercing scream and was very scared. She tried to find her husband and went to the garage, but he was not there. In addition, the garage lights were off. The woman then returned home and sat in the kitchen waiting for her husband, who returned half an hour later. Detectives also decided to dig into George's biography and talk to his ex-wife. She admitted that the man only seemed a kind, caring, and responsible man. In fact, he was very aggressive and raised his hand to her during frequent quarrels. She added that sometimes he even strangled her. After that, the investigators talked to George's close friends, and they also said something interesting. A few months before the murder, when Karen wasn't still living at the guy's house, but she visited him from time to time, George told friends that he liked her. Moreover, the detectives learned that the man occasionally participated in orgies and mentioned that he wanted to invite Karen to participate. During these conversations with George's friends, they learned that in the summer of '84, the man had a secret affair with a girl who lived in several houses from him. The police talked to her and learned something else. The girl confessed on her 17th birthday. George gave her a white lace corset. He was great for her, but the man still made the girl wear the corset regularly. The police asked them to give it to them and immediately showed it to Karen's boyfriend. He said the exact same size and the exact same size as Karen disappeared from the house. It was the first serious piece of evidence against George, but the detectives kept digging. They took his footprint and sent it to an FBI expert to compare it to the print found on Karen's bathroom floor. After a while, the results came back. Complete match. In March '86, George was called back to the police station, and the detective asked him several times if he had been at Karen's house the night of the murder. The man denied it until the detective told him about the results. Over the next few minutes, George continued to deny everything, but then gave the police a new story. This time he said he saw that red man outside Karen's house. George ran into her house and saw all around her, covered in blood, and a woman lying in the corridor with a cut on her throat. After that, he panicked and ran away from there, deciding never to mention that horror again. Of course, the detectives never believed the story for a second because it sounded completely implausible. But George was right about something, and there was a cut on the victim's throat. Except this information was never released. Even if his story were true, he wouldn't have been able to see the cut because of the amount of blood on Karen's body. At least it wasn't visible to experienced medical experts until the blood was washed away. It followed that the only way George could have known that a cut existed was if he was the killer. The above was enough to finally arrest the man. He was taken into custody on March 15, almost 2 years after the murder. In Florida, he could face the death penalty for his actions. George's close friends and colleagues at the fire department did not share the police's belief that he was the killer. They still thought he was a good man and made every effort to help him. These people gave part of their salary to George's wife and child, and even raised $300,000 to bail him out. To do this, several of his colleagues even mortgaged their homes. As a result, George was released in late December. He lived in his house for another 6 months, and the trial did not begin until 4 June '87. George's lawyers insisted that the man did not kill anyone and never changed his version of what happened to the police. However, when the suspect was given the floor, he came up with a completely new story. It was the same. He saw a man near Karen's apartment, ran into the house and saw her body. George was very sick from the sight. He ran to the bathroom, where he vomited. Apparently, this was his way of explaining the bloody footprint of his foot in the bathroom. But here was one obvious nuance. If he had originally run into Karen's house barefoot, the bloody footprints would have been from where her body was found to the bath, but they weren't there. Asked why he had not called the police, George stated that he was only 22 years old at the time and was too scared to tell anyone. It is worth noting here that a man from the age of 18 worked as a firefighter and regularly faced with monstrous situations at work. But when he saw his dead neighbor, he suddenly refused to even call the police. The prosecution insisted that George had been sympathetic to Karen for several months. Waiting for her boyfriend to leave for a week, he decided to take advantage of the situation. George broke into her house and attacked her. The woman managed to scream and even resist him, but eventually the man killed her and abused her. As for his footprint on the bathroom floor, there may be a simple explanation. According to his wife, George didn't come home until half an hour after the scream. Apparently, he tried to wash his clothes off from the blood in Karen's bathroom and took off his sock boots, which were also covered in blood. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and the jury eventually found him guilty. A month later, when his sentence was due, the judge suddenly ordered a retrial. That's what George's lawyer tried to get, and they succeeded. They insisted that the police had compromised some of the evidence and that the prosecution had failed to fully prove their client's guilt. The decision of the judge was a real shock to all those involved in the proceedings, as it rarely happens. However, the prosecutor managed to challenge this decision, and in 1989 it was revoked. As a result, George was sentenced to life imprisonment. The death penalty was abolished because the man had no criminal history before the murder. Since then, the man has tried to challenge the verdict several times, but has been rejected every time. Many of his friends and relatives continued to believe that he was innocent, despite all the evidence against him. George died in prison in 2014. He was 52 years old. He insisted to the last on his innocence, and even gave an interview in which he described how hard it was to be punished for a crime he had not committed. In this whole story, I want to mention one important point. 16 neighbors heard Karen scream, but none of them dared to call the police. Given that the police station was close to their street, the patrol could have been there within minutes. The detectives who worked the case assumed that Karen's life could have been saved, but that didn't happen. Share your opinion on this story in the comments and be sure to like it under this clip if you like it. Also recommend subscribing to my channel where I publish the most interesting criminal news from around the world. Thanks for watching.